Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Political Lens podcast. Now, we've talked about a lot of things here lately and we've been hearing a lot about the Nigerian slaughter of Christians that is happening with the Islamic jihadis, particularly Boko Haram and some other falutin militias that are over in Nigeria. We're going to discuss that and what's all going on over there, as well as what the president has been doing and what he's been talking about in his campaigns and throughout his second term. Also, it's going back into his first term as well. But let's get started on that, and then after that, we'll see what else I have for you. But like I said, Trump has raised the issue directly with publicly statements discussed about the killing of Christians with President Muhammadu Buhari during that White House meeting, urging stronger protection of the affected communities. Now, the whole world's seen, we all seen it when they got in that tussle and watched that video in front of the president that Trump had him bring up of them screaming about the Boers, kill the Boer, kill the Boer. And how they were working together, the sanctions Trump was discussing that he would use on combating them to get a handle of the situation and stop the killings. But he also reframed violence as religious persecution. His administration more openly acknowledged that the Christians were being specifically targeted rather than describing the killing solely as a communal or like a farmer-herd conflicts. He elevated the religious freedoms in the United States foreign policy. He made international religious freedoms a central diplomatic priority, which shaping how the U.S. addressed Nigeria's internal crises. He's expanded the role of the State Department's Office of International Religious Freedom under his administration. He became more vocal about Nigeria, repeatedly highlighting the attacks on the churches and the clergy, as well as the Christians and their villages. He also designated Nigeria a country of particular concern. In December of 2020, the United States formally designated Nigeria to serve violations of religious freedom, the strongest classification available for the U.S. Trump also applied the pressure, diplomatic pressure, rather than military intervention. His response focused on the public condemnation and the policy designation, not direct U.S. military involvement or sanctions tied specifically to that killings at the time. But as we've seen just over Christmas this year, he was forced to bomb the alleged terrorists for attacking a village in Stocktown, I believe, up in the northwestern part of Nigeria, or northeastern part. I'm not sure which one. I believe it's western. But yeah, he done a massive strike on the jihadi terrorists. Also, he wanted to amplify the awareness through his rhetoric. He frequently spoke about the worldwide persecution of the Christians, bringing the international attention to Nigeria, and which is one of the deadliest places in the world for Christians being persecuted. He also faced criticisms for his rhetoric and like the oversimplification that Trump's framing underplayed the ethnic, environmental, and economic factors that has contributed to the violence. Also, people feared it risk friction with diplomatic issues. It also left mixed results on the ground while awareness and diplomatic security increased. significant killings and displacement in Nigeria continued. To highlight its limits in U.S. influence, the president in 2019, and for Trump. But so these steps that he brought the awareness and was talking about it, he spoke with the president and said he's not going to tolerate these killings that continue to happen, that continues to have thousands and thousands of innocent people that worship God being killed. And I believe that's very important as I strive to be a good God-fearing man. And I consider myself a Christian as well. And I totally agree with supporting this and supporting the people that are being killed. But I think I'm gonna give you like a breakdown of just not really a breakdown. It's more of like the history of what Nigeria's been facing that you may not be aware of. Some may be. But I'm going to get going on that. Nigeria is Africa's most populous nation, which has which has decades of struggle with reoccurring waves of violence. It has claimed tens of thousands of lives. Among the most disturbing aspects of this crisis are the mass killings of the Christian communities, particularly in the northern and central regions of the country. While religious identity as a potent factor, these killings occur within examining both the immediate predators of the deeper structural conditions that enable these atrocities. Understanding the violence against Christians in Nigeria requires examining both immediate perpetrators and, like I said, the deeper structural issues. One of the primary drivers of mass killings of the Christians in Nigeria is the Islamist extremists, such as Boko Haram and the Islamic State, West Africa Province, or ISWAP, have carried out systematic attacks against Christian civilians, churches, clergy, and schools. Especially in the northeastern Nigeria, Boko Haram, whose namely loosely translates to Western education, is forbidden. It emerged in the 2000s with the aim of establishing an Islamic state governed by strict Sharia law. The Christians have been explicitly targeted because they are viewed as ideological enemies and symbols of Western influence. And these people they hate our influence. Mass abductions, church bombings, and village massacres have become tragic hallmarks of this insurgency. I'm sorry, 1 minute, I lost my spot. Everybody treated him the exact same way. And I'm not saying it's the right way or the wrong way to treat someone. If I invited somebody on my podcast... In Nigeria's Middle Belt, particularly in the states such as Benue, Plateau, and Kaduna, violence against Christian communities has taken a different but equally deadly form. Here, attacks often attributed to armed Fulani militias, many of whom are Muslim and engaged in long-standing conflicts in predominantly Christian farming communities. These clashes are frequently described as a herder conflicts driven by competition over land and water resources exacerbated by the climate change and the population growth. However, the scale of the organization and the brutality of some attacks include nighttime raids on villages, mass killings, and the destruction of churches have led many observers to argue that religious and ethnic targeting plays a significant role behind more disputes. The Nigerian government responds to these killings, and it has been widely criticized as inadequate. The survivors and human rights organizations often point to delayed military interventions, the lack of arrest of the cultural impunity that emboldens these perpetrators. In many cases, the attacks have faced no legal consequences, which reinforcing the perception among Christian communities that their lives are undervalued by the state. They have no value in their eyes. This perceived indifference has deepened the mistrust in religious groups and the weakened national unity. While the government is insisting on combating the terrorism and the boundary of inability to protect vulnerable rural communities remains a central failure. I mean, the Nigerian government is, it goes without saying, they're disgraceful. The consequences of mass killings extend beyond the immediate loss of life. The entire Christian villages have been displaced, creating large populations of internally displaced persons who lack access to education, healthcare, and livelihoods. The churches and community institutions that once served as centers of social cohesion has been destroyed, leaving deep psychological trauma in the wake. Now, the children who grow up in such violence are disrupted schooling and long-term emotional scars, perpetuating cycles of poverty and instability. Now, I watched this documentary on YouTube of this woman fleeing from her husband. Well, she was in her village, and they raided her village and killed everybody. And she took off running, and he abducted her and bought her as a slave. And then he began to sexually assault her, and she ended up having 3 kids over 7 years of being with this man. Or monster, I should say. And throughout them 7 years, she always prayed to God. It's a really good documentary. She's always prayed to God for her to have a window to escape, or for God to change her husband's heart. And then one day she had seen an opening when her husband was working, and she took her kids, and she had to go down this hill across this river. The water was treacherous, and she took all 4 of her kids. 3 of them went across with her the first time, and she was on her way back the second time when they noticed she was gone, and they started coming towards the river. She was continuously falling on the second trip going back to get her last son, but she ended up grabbing him and gotten back across, and she eventually made it back to her village. And she knew that she had family that survived the initial attack, and she's living with them now in the hopes that this gets resolved by, whether it's by her own country or the U.S. steps in to help free these people of these killings. It's a really touching video. You guys should look that up. I may add it in the description, too, of the video. The consequences of mass killings extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. Entire Christian villages have been displaced, creating large populations of internally displaced persons who lack access to education, healthcare, and livelihoods. Churches and community institutions that once served as centers of social cohesion have been destroyed, leaving deep psychological trauma in their wake. Children who grew up amid such violence and disrupted schooling had long-time emotional scars, perpetuating cycles of poverty and instability. Intentionally, the killings of Christians in Nigeria have been increasing the attention. Human rights groups and religious freedom advocates have warned that Nigeria has become one of the most dangerous countries in the world for Christians. Calls for stronger international pressure, humanitarian assistance, and security cooperation have grown louder. Though concrete results remain limited, critics argue that global responses have often been muted due to Nigeria's strategic importance of, or I'm sorry, through Nigeria's strategic importance and fear of oversimplifying a complex conflict. I also think the issue is that our media doesn't cover it. None of Western media has covered this in depth, like making it front page news. And this is the type of stuff that needs to be front page news instead of hearing them all commentate and just try to get the administration or something else that's of non-significance. In conclusion on this, mass killings of Christians in Nigeria that represent a grave human rights crisis rooted in extremist violence. The communal conflict and systemic governance failures, while religion is not the sole cause, it is undoubtedly a key factor in shaping the patterns of victimization. Addressing these strategies requires more than military force. It demands justice, accountability, equitable land policies, interfaith dialogue, and meaningful protection for all civilians, regardless of belief. Excuse me. Without such efforts, the cycle of violence will continue, threatening not only Nigeria's Christian communities, but the stability of moral fabric of the nation as a whole. Now, the historical and structural roots of the violence against the Christians in Nigeria, we're going to get into a little bit of that. The mass killings of the Christians in Nigeria cannot be understood without examining the country's historical foundations and structural weaknesses. Nigeria is a deeply diverse nation divided almost evenly between the Muslims, predominantly in the north, and Christians, largely in the south and the middle belt. The religious divisions overlap the ethnic identities, colonial legacy, and uneven development, creating persistent fault lines and the repeatedly eruptions of violence. Now, the British colonial rule played a decisive role in shaping these tensions. The colonial administration governed northern Nigeria indirectly through Muslim emirs, reinforcing the Islamic public authority. While Christian missionaries were more active in the South, the arrangement entrenched the religious segregation and produced stark educational and economic disparities that persist today. After independence in the 1960s, Nigeria struggled to forge a unified national identity, and the origin increasingly became a marker of a political loyalty and a social belonging. The rise of Islamist extremism in the late 20th and early 21st centuries marked the turning point in the violence against the Christians. Boko Haram emerged in the northwestern Nigeria, and amid widespread poverty, unemployment, and resentment toward the government's corruption. While the group initially framed its struggles as opposition to Western influence, the secular government and its ideology quickly hardened into the violent jihadism. Christians became primary targets not merely as civilians, but as symbols of opposing worldview. Churches were bombed during the worship service, pastors were assassinated, and the entire Christian villages were completely wiped out. Alongside terrorism, Nigeria's Middle Belt became a major threat to mass violence against Christian communities. The region sits in the intersection of Nigeria's Muslim north and Christian south, making it particularly vulnerable to conflict. As desertification and climate change reduced grazing land in the north, Fulani herders migrated southward into farming areas dominated by the Christians and the ethnic groups. Now, this is the Fulani militants. While these conflicts are often framed as disputes over land and cattle, the frequent targeting of Christian villages and churches and religious leaders suggests that the identity is based on the hostilities plays a significant role. Now, crucially, the Nigerian state has struggled to manage these tensions. Weak institutions, underfunded security forces, and the politicized law enforcement has created an environment in which the violence flourishes in many cases. The Christian communities repudiate the security officers who arrive hours or days after the attacks taken place. Arrests are rare, prosecutions are rare. Still, these failures to uphold the rule of law are normalized violence, or which helps normalize the violence and reinforce perceptions of religious bias within its institutions. Alrighty, hold on a second. Now, I can continue to discuss the horrible, degrading, disgusting things that the terrorists have been doing to the Nigerian Christians, but I'm gonna move into like the cause or what has caused these civilians so much pain and heartache, and like the impact of it and the responsibilities of the governments or the government, I should say, as well as governments who help out. What should go forward moving forward with this process other than to completely eliminate the Boko Haram and these militia groups. The human cost of the mass killings in Nigeria is immense and enduring. Beyond the thousands of deaths, entire communities have been uprooted. Christian families have led ancestral lands seeking refuge in eternal displaced persons in camps where living conditions are deplorable. Livelihoods based on farming and local trade have been destroyed, plunging survivors into long-term poverty and dependency. Psychological trauma is another devastating consequence. Survivors frequently witness the murder of family members, the burning of homes, and the desecration of all their churches. For many faith communities that has provided stability have been shattered. Children growing up in violence, facing interrupted educational systems, and the chronic fear and limited opportunities, creating the generation at risk of continued instability and resentment. The Nigerian government bears primary responsibility of protecting its citizens, yet its response to mass killings has consistently fallen short. Official statements often frame the violence as generalized of communal clashes, banditry of the communal clashes, minimizing religious targeting and obscuring patterns of victimization. The reluctance to acknowledge the specific suffering of the Christian community has fueled the distrust and accusations of complicity or indifference. While the government has launched military operations against these insurgents, these efforts are often reactive rather than preemptive, and to fail to address the root causes such as the lands and reform, disarmament, and the justice of the victims. Internationally, the killings have raised serious concerns about religious freedoms and human rights advocacy groups, which have labeled Nigeria one of the deadliest countries in the world for the Christians, urging stronger diplomatic pressure and targeted sanctions against perpetrators, which Trump has acknowledged that he would use. However, the global response has been inconsistent. Nigeria's strategic importance economically, politically, and militarily has often tempered international criticism, leaving victims feeling abandoned by the global communities. Addressing these mass killings of the Christians in Nigeria requires a comprehensive approach, and security measures must be prepared with accountability, including the impartial investigations and prosecutions. Land use policies must balance the farmers and herders while preventing armed groups of exploiting disputes. Interfaith dialogue, although insufficient on its own, remains essential for rebuilding the trust of the local level. Above all, the Nigerian state must reaffirm commitment to protecting all citizens equally, regardless of their religion. In conclusion, the mass killings of Christians in Nigeria are not isolated tragedies, but symptoms of a deeper systemic failures. It reflects the dangerous intersection of extremism, identity politics, and the environmental stress and weak governance. Without decisive action, the killings will continue to erode social cohesion and threaten Nigeria's future. Confronting this crisis is not only a moral imperative but a prerequisite for lasting peace and stability in the nation. With the policy and global religious freedom, the mass killings of the Christians in Nigeria have long drawn concern from human rights organizations, which I've mentioned two previous times, leaders, and the international observers. During Donald Trump's presidency in 2017 through 21, the issue gained heightened visibility of the U.S. political discourse, particularly within the framework of religious freedom and counterterrorism. The Trump administration's a notable shift in how the United States publicly addressed the violence against the Christians in Nigeria, framing it merely as communal conflict, but as a serious religious freedom and security crisis. His confrontation of the issues reflected a mix of moral advocacy, particularly in the northern and central Nigeria, is where these churches and communities are being taken over. Framing responded strongly as American evangelical communities and international religious freedom advocates who had long argued that Christians are being disproportionately targeted. One of the most symbolic moments of the Trump confrontation and issue occurred during the 2019 meeting, which I've mentioned, about the Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari at the White House. Trump repeatedly raised concerns about the killings of the Christians directly with the Buhari, urging him to do more to protect the vulnerable communities. The public acknowledgement was significant because Buhari, as a Muslim from northern Nigeria, had often criticized the downplaying and the reframing of the violence as a generalized insecurity. However, Trump's willingness to raise the issue at the highest diplomatic level signaled that the United States viewed the killings not only as a Nigerian internal matter, but both as serious human rights concerns as well. Policy actions further underscored the stance under Trump. The U.S. State Department expanded the role of the official international religious freedom, elevating religious persecution as a key criterion and diplomatic engagement. Nigeria was eventually designated a country of particular concern of the religious freedom violations, placing alongside nations such as Iran and North Korea. The designation is controversial, but it represented one of the strongest formal rebukes of Nigeria's handling of the religious violence by any United States administration. Supporters saw it as a long overdue accountability critique, argued it oversimplified a complex conflict of risk-straining relations with a key African partner. Trump's rhetoric also played a role. He frequently spoke about the global persecution of the Christians, presenting it as a neglected crisis of the international affairs. In doing so, he positioned himself as a defender of the Christian worldwide, including regions such as the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. In the Nigerian context, this rhetoric amplified international awareness of Christian suffering and pressured global institutes to acknowledge these patterns of targeting violence. However, critics contended that Trump's language sometimes lacked nuance, failing to fully address the ethnic, environmental, and economic dimensions of this conflict. Despite those confrontational gestures, Trump approach faced limitations. While the religious freedom designations and diplomatic pressure raised awareness, they did not fundamentally alter the conditions on the ground in Nigeria. Killing continued, displacement worsened, and Nigerian security forces remained obstructed and often ineffective. Moreover, some of them argued that Trump's border foreign policy, marked by reduced emphasis on multilateral cooperation, limited the ability of the United States to mobilize, coordinate international actions in response to the crisis. Domestically, Trump's continuation of Nigerian Christian killings also served political purpose. His strong stance aligned with his base, particularly evangelical Christians who view global persecution of the Christians as a moral emergency. This alignment reinforced Trump's image as a champion of Christian values, even as critics questioned his consistency of the human rights advocacy of different cases, not just Nigeria. In conclusion, Donald Trump's confrontation of the mass killings of the Christians in Nigeria represented a noble departure from the previous U.S. approaches in its explicit acknowledgement of religious persecution. Through diplomatic pressure, policy designations, and public rhetoric, his administration brought unprecedented attention to the crisis. However, while Trump elevated the issue on the global stage, structural changes within Nigeria and the limits of the U.S. influence meant that the tangible improvements remained elusive. His legacy on this issue is mixed, significant in raising awareness of reshaping discourse, but constrained in achieving lasting protection for the Christian communities. In the end, Donald Trump's confrontation of the mass killings of Christians in Nigeria illustrate both the potential and the limits of international political pressure. By alleviating religious freedom to a central place in the United States foreign policy and public challenging Nigeria's leadership, Trump brought unprecedented attention to a crisis that had long been minimized or ignored on the global stage. His actions reshaped the conversation around these violence, forcing policy makers of international observers to acknowledge the religious dimensions of the conflict. Yet awareness alone proved insufficient to halt the bloodshed. Lasting solutions require sustained accountability, effective governance, and genuine commitment with the Nigerian authorities. Supported by coordinated international engagement, Trump's legacy is an issue that stands as a reminder that confronting injustice is essential first steps, but enduring the peace demands a far more recognition of its demands and justice and the resolve of the Christians being killed. And as this moves forward into Trump's second year, we just heard about him doing a massive strike on Nigeria, which has allegedly took out some of these fighters that are killing these Christians, but only time will tell. Also, I think the other countries in the surrounding area of Nigeria need to come to the table as well to help find solutions to end this as immediately as possible. And I want to know what you guys think as well, so please give me any input you guys have on the situation, as well as whatever you think could also help in the situation moving forward. But I just want to bring attention to this because, like I said, the news media, the stations on TV, radio, whatever, they're not talking about it barely at all. You might find it 5 pages later inside of a article or something online, but it's not front and center like it should be. I pray for the Christians in Nigeria, and I pray and hope that this gets resolved as soon as possible. But I also want to thank you guys for watching yet another episode. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Have a good day.